Hi, Misha here, and it's time for part 3 in our look at Federation Starfleet starships. In part 1, we looked at pre-warp ships, all the way through the NX program, and up to the founding of the Federation. Part 2, we went from the early Federation, the early Warp 7 ships, through the 22nd century, looking at the era of the Constitution and the late Constitution refits. And that's where we ended, right as the 24th century was dawning. In video 3, we pick up at the tail end of the 23rd century, and we begin with the Great Experiment, the Excelsior. And from there, we'll progress through Starfleet's golden age, as it was known, of exploration, science, and peace. An age that would last over half a century, but then would rudely and abruptly be ended in the 2360s. So even though we're not quite covering a century in this video, a lot does and doesn't happen, and we see a lot of technological advancement, but also stagnation. So with that, let's dive in to the final days of the reign of the Connie. My friends, the Great Experiment. But not quite yet. Before we can talk about the Excelsior herself, a very successful class and design, we have to talk about some that were less so. In the 2270s and early 2280s, efforts were underway to basically get past warp field inefficiency, to develop greater speed, yes, but also better acceleration and warp field control, and frankly, finally get away from the Cochrane Archer engine, at least severely improve it and kind of move to the next major step. Going from horizontal to vertical warp drives certainly helped, but something truly new was needed. Now, we looked at the Constellation, the 4 nacelle design based on the vertical warp core. That was one effort. As I said, that first launched in 2284. That was one of the most conservative design attempts, using tested technology just kind of doubling up. But different design bureaus and teams tried more radical things, and here we have one of the early efforts. Another quad nacelle design. It is using an alternative warp system and nacelle arrangement. It's a very long, very sleek vessel, but also very thin, and was a test bed for new technologies. These were produced, but in very limited numbers, perhaps only a couple of prototypes, and do not seem to have been very successful. One interesting thing, though, we do see pylons with cutouts in them. So what came next? From long, thin, and sleek, we go to something a bit bulkier, and still keeping the quad nacelle arrangement, having a larger deflector than the previous study concept model. This also had variable geometry nacelles, essentially moving nacelle pylons to try to better adjust the warp field displacement. Interestingly, this would be re-examined 100 years later, but it was an effort and reconfigured yet again. But they quickly realized that with this system going to 4 nacelles, just the costs aren't worth the benefits. So while they would again build a small number of ships in this type for testing and whatnot, they would not mass produce them. And our next design might at first seem a little more conservative. However, it might be the more successful of the three, using the same basic nacelles but only having 2 of them, and streamlining the engineering hull, integrating it quite smoothly into the saucer. This was produced in slightly larger numbers in the 2280s and was more successful, with the USS Alka-Seltzer being the most famous member of this, making this presumably the Alka-Seltzer class. It is certainly a design step forward, and it did have some benefits. It was more stable at warp 9 and above, and more economical to produce than the previous quad nacelle arrangements. However, the powers that be pushed things to the limit for the next Federation Starfleet heavy cruiser. Now we can talk about the USS Excelsior of the Excelsior class NX 2000. This is one of the most revolutionary vessels since the original Constitution, and before that the Daedalus, and before that the NX. This was meant to be the heavy cruiser to replace the Constitution and others, and it did so, and would remain in production for decades and service for a century. But it took a long while to get it going. This was a very advanced vessel. At the heart of things, it had the new trans-warp drive. It could achieve warp 9.5 for short bursts, and could cruise at close to warp 9 almost indefinitely. Certainly warp 8, 8.5 was no problem for it. More efficiency, but more importantly, it could jump from essentially sublight speeds directly to higher warp speeds. Maybe not directly from 0 to warp 9, but certainly from 0 to warp 6 or warp 7 without an effort. This was a very good thing for speed acceleration. It also made travel within solar systems much safer than had previously been experienced with the Enterprise refit style systems. It also was more fuel efficient, not having to ramp up, just going straight to it, and also not having to slow down for that matter. Only at high warp did it have to maybe kind of go through more traditional acceleration, although it could possibly be pushed past the red line if needs be. But the advancements absolutely did not stop at the engines. It had an all-new framework. This is not a retrofit Constitution, Miranda, not like the Constellation class. It is originally about 465 meters long, with a crew of roughly 700 to 750. It's one of the most cavernous vessels we've seen to the point. Shuttle bay in the back, plenty of room in the engineering hull for science and other things. A recessed deflector, and uprated photon torpedo tubes, and the next generation of phasers. Not to mention much more powerful shielding being supplied by the new warp core system. All in all, new computers, new everything. This was almost a totally ground up experiment. And construction on the first vessel began around 2280. By 2282, 2283, crews were being assigned, and in 2284, she was complete in space dock and ready to begin testing. Now, this was an NX class, NX 2000. We don't usually see the name ships in a class. They're usually kept back for testing and trials, because with any new ship there are bugs. And so this is why we don't see, for example, the USS Constitution or the USS Miranda, what have you. So the plan was to use her near Earth to run tests and then have full production models. And despite a little bit of a hiccup in the beginning, after repairs were made, she would continue testing near Earth through the year 2287. And then after that, she would get a brief refit, correcting little bugs. She would go from the testing bridge, essentially a large bridge with more monitoring equipment for the systems, and a new module would be dropped in for actual deep space exploration, a more compact bridge, a more efficient bridge for that, also giving room for, a ready room and other things, a conference room, which weren't needed for a prototype. Again, like the Constitution before her, the bridge module was modular. By the way, she had 34 decks. So she would get a small refit, and she was cleared for deep space voyage, her first 5-year voyage, in the year 2290, under the command of Captain Hikaru Suru. And Sulu would, of course, take this on several missions and really prove the class as really, the next step forward. And it was a working trans-warp drive, as it was called. Although later the trans was simply dropped and warp drive. In fact, this would eventually lead to the recalibration of the whole warp scale around the year 2312, by which time the Excelsior was pretty much the fleet standard. And even though these were large, because the Federation was at peace, they were able to mass produce these both at San Francisco and Utopia Planitia, making several, including quite a famous subclass. Before we do that, one thing I should point out: once the Excelsior had completed its testing and trials phase, and after its refit, it was redesignated from NX 2000 to NCC 2000. Anyway, in 2293, the Excelsior Enterprise subclass, or refit, was first fielded. Yes, the design was successful enough, it would be the next Enterprise in the series. And this version was slightly longer, at just under 470 meters, had more scientific and diplomatic facilities, and since it was expected for deep space operations, it was given the ability for saucer separation, and because of that, additional impulse manifolds were added to the saucer in the rear. The nacelles were slightly tweaked and reworked for better efficiency at higher warps, as was the engineering hull. Small fins, protrusions added partially to protect the deflector, partially as additional energy storage. A few refits, a few tweaks to the design. Not all Excelsiors in the class would get this refit. In fact, many would not. This was kind of the top of the line flagship refit. We would see a few others like the USS Lakota, but most would still be built to the original standard. And again, they would keep building the Excelsior class for decades, with the USS Dallas being the final brand new Excelsior ship built. But once in service, these became favorites of admirals who started serving on them as ensigns and young lieutenants. So as they became of the rank, flag rank, they had fond memories, and this vessel was kept up to date. We even know that they were able to be refit to use modern weapons like quantum torpedoes. It was a very modular, sturdy design, like the Constitution before it. This is actually what allowed the Constitution to be retired at the end of the 23rd century. They had such a good, sturdy replacement, even if some old-time space boomers were not so sure of it. But we do know that the USS Melbourne was rebuilt at Starbase in 2364, and also the USS Hood would be rebuilt and modernized a short time later. So we see Excelsiors still being actively maintained and updated well into the 24th century, and we still see members of this class serving quite prolifically into the 2370s and even 2380s. By which time, yes, it is getting rather long in the tooth, so nearly a century old, and maybe not quite as fast as it used to be compared to newer designs. But still, it was such a flexible, well-rounded vessel, good combat abilities, good diplomatic facilities, an ample shuttle bay. It was just a jack-of-all-trades vessel, and would start a whole new generation in Starfleet. And that's what we see. While most in this era would just be Excelsior types, we would see other starships built and based on the same new technology. To complement the Excelsior heavy cruiser, we had the Centaur class light cruiser, built with the same technology and introduced in the early 24th century. This is essentially the Miranda equivalent, a design that goes all the way back to the Hoover and the Mayflower design. It's about 210 meters long, crew of about 200. It is capable of warp 9 plus, like the Excelsior, good acceleration. It does actually have weapons pod attachment, so at least certain variants can have up to 4 photon torpedoes. Has the improved phasers. This is a patrol craft, an escort craft. It can also serve as a transport and a support vehicle in general. This is not a deep space solo, years-long mission operator. This is a working within the Federation and around its borders vessel for months on end. But a very dependable design, and like a lot of the Miranda styles, it can definitely punch above its weight class and do so without having a huge crew and being a major investment in terms of production. So we see these serving with rather good distinction for decades throughout the mostly peaceful first half of the 24th century into the Cardassian War era and into the Dominion War era, where they are a good match for fighter vessels from the Jem'Hadar and theoretically a Klingon bird of prey, kind of in that class. And it's built on Excelsior technology. Our next vessel, though, is a bit of a hodgepodge. What happens if you take the Excelsior warp core central power plant and pair it with the older Constitution pattern nacelles and move things around a bit? You get this. The Shelley class, specifically this is the USS Curry, and this is classed as a medium cruiser at about 380 meters long, so about the same size as Excelsior, and it has a crew of roughly 400. And the idea, we're going to sacrifice a little bit of speed for power generation, because we still have the Excelsior warp core power systems, but we have the older, slower, but might be more energy efficient nacelles. We can divert that power to shielding and other systems, and that's what they did. So this has a maximum warp of 9 and more of a sustained warp of about 7.57 for long durations. And it has an interesting way of doing its engineering hull, with the deflector put more towards the front and quite a bit of cargo bay storage and shuttle bay storage in the back. So basically this could act as a transport, a freighter, also a vehicle you could send in to resupply colonies in a hazardous environment if there was a natural disaster, because while it is not a flashy vessel, it does have strong shields, good hull armor, it's a compact design. It's also good as a science vessel. It has a little bit of a reminiscence of the Oberth. You could send this into a nebula or stellar body that was having instabilities, and it would probably put up with the punishment a bit more. So a rather specialized vessel, but one that served a role in the fleet, again, as a medium cruiser. And this would be expected to kind of do intermediate duration missions. And because of its cargo storage and large shuttle bay, it could be used for resupply better than whatnot. And again, you're not tying up a valuable Excelsior, and you're using the very sturdy Constitution pattern nacelles. This might have been a little bit of hedging their bets too, just in case the technology didn't work out as much as they'd hoped for. And this too would be introduced in either the late 23rd or early 24th century. And we do see these used as passenger transports and support vehicles well into the Dominion War period. So we have the USS Curry, we also have the USS Raging Queen, because that's what you want to name your ship, right? On the other hand, it only seems to have one photon torpedo tube, but it still has regular phasers. Memorable design? Well, it's certainly that. After the success of the Excelsior class and her variants, Starfleet would remain kind of where it was at for a while. They would also continue to use quite a few Oberths and Mirandas, with the Constitution and older designs out. So with that, let's check in with the civilian and just, non-Starfleet Federation members for a minute. So here we have another Antares class. We looked at the old Starfleet version survey ship. Well, this is a freighter transport. This is the USS Arcos. Pretty standard design that has been in service since at least the mid 23rd century, possibly even older, or variants of. These were assembled, at least some of them, at the Luna shipyards. Depending on the exact variant, they're about 270, 290 meters long. And they can have a crew of anywhere from just 2, as we see on the Arcos, to more. We'll get to in a minute. They have a top speed of warp 6.5 new scale, so fine. They can haul quite a wide range of freight or even some somewhat unstable materials. Quite a bit of room, obviously with only 2 folks on board. Good bulky thing. Interesting warp and impulse setup here. They have deflector shields, escape pods, and just basic low yield phasers for defense. And that's about it. It's often been likened to a tramp steamer in space. And these are operated not just by Federation members, but private humans outside of the Federation, and have been sold and operated to alien races like the Patarians. So, our next member is the SS Zoza, another Antares member. And we see another one of her sister ships, the SS Norkova. Same basic hull, just laid out differently. This version definitely seems to be of an older 23rd century style. It even has the old school Mark V lateral transporters like we saw with the Walker class and the Hiawatha. This one does have a larger crew of around 12, and it can haul a good bulk of supplies or other freight. I guess in a pinch these could be used as a passenger transport too, but they're not really configured for that. One interesting fact, whereas most Starfleet starship bridges are ovular or circular, the bridge for these is very utilitarian. It's a rectangle or square depending on the exact ship, and just, yeah, it's a workroom. And it comes across. And while we see some of these updated with modern technology, computer readouts, controls, we see the Zoza with old 23rd century style controls. Again, it's a tramp steamer. It does its thing. It hauls bulk cargo. It has shielding for defense, basic phasers, again, nothing fancy. It'll get there, maybe not the fastest, but it'll get there reasonably. And these will haul things around. There's the galaxy. And we see these ships operating for decades, usually owned by families. So they're kind of in the same vein as the old Y class and J classes, going back to Mayweather's day, the old boomers. And that service is alive and well. I'm not sure if it's still the ECS, Earth Cargo Service. Probably at this point it is not. Probably more of a Federation registry. We see a few different ones used. And again, some operate nominally under Starfleet, others under the Federation flag, and others private, unaligned. And this design is just, it's so prevalent throughout the galaxy, which means spare parts and all that are easy to find. But yeah, these are supply, freight, or transports. What about for humans? And it occurs to me saying humans is rather speciest of me, so we'll say life forms, personnel, passengers. Here, we have the answer to that. The Worfen class. We see the SS Lecole and the SS Robert Fox transporting Elorians in 2293, but this is not an Elorian design. In fact, the original Worfen was actually operated by Starfleet and had a NCC registry, but most of these are not. In fact, this has an NFT registry, and that NFT was long before NFTs, you know. It's about the same size, about 270 meters long, and this was designed for long-duration passenger transport. Basically, it's a liner. It had a crew of 12 to 15, and it could carry up to 250 passengers. So, and it had multiple decks and entertainment. It cruised at warp 4. It could get up to warp 6. So, yeah, but it was, again, meant for long duration. It actually had engines designed specifically for efficient travel, low fuel usage, that kind of thing. Basic deflector shields, no real weaponry. It was a passenger transport. And a good one that served for quite some time. not much more to say about it, frankly. It definitely has alien influences. Hard to say if it was actually made by humans or just operated by them at times. Alternative design thing, but again, the Federation isn't just humans, so it's a passenger transport to go across the galaxy. And these are used 23rd and 24th century for quite some time. Along the same lines, but a little more human in design, possibly even Starfleet, we have the Sydney class. It uses a variant of the Constitution nacelle system and a main body with plenty of room for passengers. Overall, it's about 235 meters and can carry 200 plus passengers and a small crew on top of that. It is a starship nominally, but mostly, yes, it's a passenger transport like the Warfin class. But it is a little faster with a top speed of roughly warp 7, possibly warp 8 in small doses. And it uses old school transporters, more advanced than lateral, but still 23rd century technology transporters. And these are meant for medium to long range missions, not missions rather, but it's basically a 747 in space, taking people where they needed to go. It has a small, more or less traditional bridge module, so most of the space is left for passengers and their possessions, baggage, that kind of thing. And we do see these in service at the tail end of the 23rd century with the USS Jenolan, but the USS Nash is actually still making runs to DS9 into the 2370s. Probably a much more updated design version, but it's still doing its thing, and why not? If Mirandas are still flying, why not the Sydney? So we've looked at ore freighters and passenger transports, but what about science research vessels? For that, we have the Jeffries class. This is specifically the SS Raven. Some of these were operated by Starfleet, others by Federation institutions, research universities, which is where we encountered this, but these were in service by the early to mid 24th century and are one of the smaller starships available that can still operate independently. Go much smaller than this, and typically the vessel, even if it has an NCC registry, will operate from a larger ship or station. This is about 90 meters long and has a total of 4 decks, although 2 of them are kind of only partial decks. So we have 2 full decks for the inhabitants and then 2 more service utility engineerings. It even has a small shuttle bay because, again, this is a research vessel, so it can carry 1 to 2 small shuttles. It has quite a good sensor package. It has shielding. Unknown if it has any phaser defenses, but if so, they would be very minor. It can be operated by a small crew of just 2, much like the Arcos, but it can transport more scientists and researchers if necessary, if needed. So it is a starship. A little bit of a kind of scaled down version compared to, say, an Oberth. Now this one was not in service in the 23rd century. It is a solidly 24th century design, and it actually is capable of quite high warp for what it is. It can easily hit warp 8 and even briefly touch on warp 9 for small periods of time. So much faster than what we've seen. It's a more advanced vessel than what we've seen in civilian hands, but affordable enough that universities can use it kind of like a much more expanded version of what we saw in the 22nd century. And these can operate for months, maybe even a year, without major refit, resupply. So that's good. But yeah, that's what's kind of going on in the non-Starfleet in the civilian sector. And it's a good time for them. After final treaties with the Romulans in the early 24th century and the Khitomer Accord with the Klingons in the late 23rd, the Federation is enjoying a very prosperous time, a golden age of exploration and science. They really don't have any adversaries. Once in a blue moon, you'll have things like the Romulans pop out, but that's rare. And it really would not be until the Cardassian border wars in the 2340s and 2350s that any real conflict of note, and even those were more skirmishes, would take place. This would be a double-edged sword. It would allow Starfleet to build very ambitious ships, very peaceful, scientific, advanced ships, but it would also breed complacency. And there will definitely be a culmination to this. But let's return to the Excelsior and what was planned to replace it. When looking at the Starfleet in the early and even mid-24th century, we mostly had 23rd century vessel designs. That is until the Ambassador-class heavy cruiser came along. This would be one of only a few designs from this period that would be truly new. But even it was built with a lot of tried and tested technology from before that was just simply refined and modestly advanced and updated. The Ambassador took what was good about the Excelsior and went further with it. And interestingly, in two seemingly opposite directions. One, it was more combat-oriented, at least it had the potentiality for it. It had better sublight maneuverability, agility. The Excelsior was quite fast, but more in a straight line than turning. This had more focus on that. It also was one of the earliest vessels to use phaser strips, which gave a much wider arc of fire and also powerful, more precise beams. It also was one of the earliest to go to kind of a multi-in-one torpedo tube system. While it only had two torpedo tubes, one forward, one rear, each could launch multiple torpedoes in a spread or cluster. And it had further advancements in shielding, and it also had a more powerful deflector and a new pattern of nacelle with more exposed chiller grills and whatnot. But, on the other hand, it had more room. The Ambassador was considerably larger than the Excelsior at about 525 meters, but it also had a wider, larger saucer and even larger engineering hull. At the same time, it only had a crew of about 700. So about the same as the Excelsior. The extra space was used for science and all that for sure, and storage, sure, but it was also used for diplomatic missions, and it was used to provide more spacious crew quarters, more individual quarters. Lower ranking officers and enlisted still had to often bunk together, but even as low as lieutenant junior grade might have their own quarters on board these. And in fact, Starfleet would begin an experiment with the Ambassador class. For proven, well-trusted officers, they were allowed to have their families on board. Limited purpose. So, bit of a trial out there. But again, this is peacetime for the most part. The ship was prepared more for combat, but frankly didn't face a whole lot of it. not early on. The class was first tested in the year 2319, and by the year 2324, the USS Ambassador herself was cleared for deep space voyages. So, much like with the Excelsior before, this heavy cruiser was kept around for testing and trials for a few years. And really, by the next year, more than one of these was already in service as a heavy deep space cruiser, diplomatic ship, research vessel, and as a defense craft if the need arose, which it really wouldn't for a while. In 2332, the Enterprise NCC 1701C would be launched as a member of the Ambassador class, and she would serve for over a decade. And this class would not become as prevalent as the Excelsior, but it would be kind of the backbone of the fleet. It had some new technologies. It went to a new style of nacelle, as I pointed out, the phaser ships. But on the other hand, if you look on the inside, things like the bridge module, the computer systems, they're really just a continuation and slight improvement on what was in the Excelsior. So the computer systems were just kind of the same. And that's partially what held this back. Even though it had some new things, it still really had a lot in common with the 23rd century fleet. Nevertheless, they were king between about 2325 and 2360. For nearly 4 decades, this was the permanent Starfleet cruiser, and even into the 2360s, ships like the USS Horatio were still considered very much top of the line. The last one seemed to have been built around 2370, completed around 2372, and that would seem to be the final production run for the Ambassador. So while they never mass-produced them like the Excelsior, they did build them for 50 years. Not bad. And they would spawn a small family of their own, similar to the previous model. For example, the Niagara class fast cruiser. This was almost the same engineering hull and saucer as the Ambassador, but it went to a new pattern of experimental warp nacelle, and it used 3 of them. So, a bit of a spiritual successor to the old Armstrong class, but I have to admit I like the layout better. This was testing a new warp system and trying to squeeze more out of it. Hiccups. Sorry. Between me and the cat, this will be fun. Yes, Hopo. Yeah. So the Ambassador wasn't that much faster than the Excelsior. Of course, the Excelsior really pushed the envelope. It really focused on better sublight maneuverability and the like. The Niagara tried to push that. And between the new nacelles and having 3 versus 2, yes, we have redundancy. Maybe better acceleration too. It had a maximum speed of warp 9.1 safe, but it could actually achieve warp 9.6. So the fastest to do so far. So far before we were up to 9.4. Keep in mind with the new scale introduced in 2312, maximum warp is warp 10. So these point whatevers past 9 are actually exponential increases. So there's quite a difference between 0.4 and 0.6. But it could not maintain that for very long. But even being able to hit 9.1 and sustain it was pretty good. It had a smaller crew than the Ambassador at about 530, but it was slightly longer at about 550 meters just because of the different layout. Otherwise, it was the same. This model was introduced in 2349, so pretty much right in the middle of the Cardassian border wars. It would make sense why they would want to take one of the more heavily armed cruisers and make it faster. It was more of a rapid response craft in that war, to kind of fill the line, respond to SOSs, respond to colonies, like Ep.3. And while they didn't mass produce these, they did make a good number of them, and they would remain in service for roughly 20 years. But really what makes the Niagara class, this is the USS Princeton for what it's worth, important was their experimentation with the new type of nacelle. Otherwise, it's kind of the older technology, the older style deflector, saucer engineering hull from the Ambassador. And from there, we have one more member of this immediate family. From the Ambassador and Niagara, we have the Narendra class. And at first this might look radically different, but in a lot of ways, it's actually really just a kind of a fresh external coating on much of the same systems as from the Ambassador, so it's considered a neighboring design. Now, we do have full phaser strips for the first time, since they proved to be successful in the first couple of designs. And we do have a more protected deflector dish. And we have an interesting nacelle variant. They're trying out a different kind of technology here, blending Excelsior and Ambassador patterns. We actually do have quite a large shuttle bay. This is a sleeker design. It's a little bit longer at about 560 meters and has a crew of 800. This was named after the battle where the Enterprise C was lost fighting the Romulans, defending the Klingon outpost on Narendra 3 in the year 2344. So this design had already been on the drawing board before that, but when it was launched, the pilot ship was named the USS Narendra in commiseration and celebration. Klingons for you have that event. And it would first launch around the year 2351. So just a couple of years after the Niagara. This was considered a support cruiser, which frankly was just talk for a combat cruiser. Again, this is during the Cardassian border wars. There was still plenty of room on board for scientific missions, even families if need be, but there was more mind towards defense. We're still in the golden age, that's for sure, but we've at least had a tiny bit of a bloody nose and roughed up knuckle. So this was built as a slightly more capable version. They could get there faster. It also integrated some of the technology from the Niagara. It's not quite as fast as the Niagara, but it can reach about warp 9.5, and it can sustain 9.1 as well. So it's markedly faster than the Excelsior and a little bit faster than the Ambassador, while still not sacrificing sublight speed and abilities. It also was one of the first to start trying out new computer displays and a new computer core system. Not completely to the next generation, but whereas the Ambassador internally looked a lot like the old Excelsior, this started to look more like a true 24th century Starfleet starship inside. And you can kind of tell that by the hull and just general aesthetics of the vessel. But it was just an interim measure, a step on the road to really the next big leap forward. In the year 2332, right as the Enterprise C was leaving space dock, work was underway. The design phase, the planning phase, for the next step forward. And they knew it would take time. This was really to make a new generation of vessels geared towards deep space exploration, possibly having more families or civilians, professionals on board, more advanced computers, even artificial intelligence, and a new technology known as holodeck. One of the first ship classes of the new design pattern would be the Narlands class, first launched around 2340, tested, and then put into the field a few years later. And members of this class would become famous during the Cardassian border wars. For example, the USS Rutledge would do heavy duty there. There would also be the USS Thomas Paine and the USS Kaishu here. This was defined as a heavy frigate, and it was meant to test new technologies, including a new system of detaching and reattaching star drive and saucer. Before, when starships detached, they essentially had to be put back together at space dock, although some of them, with painstaking diligence, could be put back together in space themselves. But this was a new idea of making this a more common feature. Also, a new pattern of deflector, and further refining of the nacelles that we would also see on the Niagara. Kind of concurrent use on those. Of course, they're both based on the Ambassador nacelle, so it makes sense. Yeah, new technologies. And it was featuring pods. In peacetime, these could be sensor pods. And in wartime, they can be torpedo pods. In fact, they could carry quite a few torpedoes, firing front and back on the bottom. That, combined with full phaser strips, would make the Narlands class quite a punchy little vessel, hence the heavy frigate designator. It was about 440 meters long, had a crew of roughly 500, and it was capable of achieving warp 9.3. Considering its bulk and that it wasn't designed for speed at the time necessarily, that's fine. But it was a technological testbed, but it actually proved to be quite a good ship. A small vessel for what it was, but able to definitely hit above its weight class. It would actually stay in service throughout the 2360s and even into the 2370s, at least the surviving members. But again, this became most identifiable with footage from the Cardassian border wars, which started around 2347 and would last roughly a decade. But really, this just helped usher in a new generation. These were used for scientific and research missions, also medium-range exploration, and rapid response, and frankly, straight combat. This could hold in a firefight much better than an old Miranda or even Excelsior. So, these were quite a common sight, flanking the Ambassador and in many ways improving upon it. And it would be part of a new fleet in the 2350s. In the fine tradition of the Hermes, Saladin, Einstein classes, we have the Freedom class, USS Firebrand and USS Concord being two well-known members. This is slightly shorter than the Narlands at about 430 meters and had a somewhat smaller crew of about 370. And it was classed as a light frigate. Why frigate? Meaning typically more offense than you'd expect for its size. I mean, it does have phaser strips, a relatively new technology when it was coming in, but they are partial phaser strips, more like an ambassador. And it did have 2 forward-facing torpedo tubes, but they were of the older style used on the Constitution and Excelsior, not the newer mass launch ones. No, what made it a frigate was it was one of the few Starfleet vessels to have a phaser cannon on the underside of its saucer, which gave it a certain hit probability. Later cannons will be quite common, but in this era it's quite a rarity. That's because this was designed as a convoy escort to protect freighters, merchant ships, like the Antares we already looked at, against Nausicaans, Orion, pirates, other raiders, things of that nature. So it was an escort vessel, much like the previous Hermes. It was a scout, short-range exploration if needs be, but not really meant to be exploring space. Patrol vessel, border patrol. It did a lot of that during the Cardassian Wars. And it could also do survey missions and some other mild scientific missions like that. Even though it was a single nacelle, it was an oversized type for its day, and it's the same pattern as tried out by the Niagara, so it could reach warp 9.2, although it had a lower cruise of about warp 7 for full sustainment. On the other hand, at sublight, it was actually quite maneuverable because it was relatively slim and trim. This was introduced around 2351, and was an effective design they could mass produce. And these would even be used as essentially police vessels, law enforcement, cutters, kind of replacing old vessels like the Soyuz, filling that role. So, search and seizure types. Just a good workaday ship. And while it was built with a little bit of the older technology, again, partial phaser strips and a bit of the old style torpedo launchers, it had the new nacelle, and it had a phaser cannon, so that was a thing. So these would be escort and support and reconnaissance vessels in the fleet for a number of years. So we have a heavy frigate and a light frigate in this new pattern. Next, we have the Challenger class light cruiser. This was designed for more medium-range exploration missions and science, but it could also serve as a rapid response and quick VIP transport because it was quite fast. The new engine arrangement would get it up to warp 9.6 temporarily, and it could sustain warp of over 9.1 to even 9.2 for quite an extended period. So quite efficient. Had a very streamlined engineering section here. Hull. It's actually smaller than our frigates at about 400 meters, and has a relatively modest crew of about 300, but that gives it plenty of room for transporting individuals, equipment, supplies, what have you. Again, we're using the new pattern of nacelles, new engine types. We do have phaser strips, although photon armament seems to be modest at best. This was not really designed for combat or confrontation. It just had phasers and shielding for self-defense. But it was fast at warp and sublight, and it was well appointed for its size internally to transport flag officers, diplomats, members of the Federation Council, and it could get them there quite quickly. It's a lot more elegant way of reaching warp 9.6 versus the Niagara, which is quite large and bulky compared. So yeah, a neat little support cruiser, and it could go and do extended missions, maybe not 5 years, but several months on its own exploring certain sectors of space. Just a bit of a jack of all trades support vessel that could be produced economically. And these would first appear around 2355. So they really did not see use in the Cardassian Wars. And that's good because, again, they weren't really designed for combat so much. And from there, things would progress and continue. Next, we move to the Springfield class light cruiser or support cruiser, USS Chekhov. It's one of our smallest vessels of this era at about 325 meters, so only a little larger than the old Constitution. It has an interesting nacelle variant they're trying out, a little more beefed up. But it also has a removable, replaceable large pod on the back to make it mission specific or just carry cargo. It had a crew of about 400. There's a lot going on in this ship. It was meant for exploration to some extent and support missions, supply missions, diplomatic, and just basically support. I mean, it carried things. Had dual photon launchers, strip phasers, pretty standard technology. What they're really trying out here is the detaching swappable pod system. Different sizes and everything. And how well a multi-purpose type cruiser will work out. It was capable of warp 9.2 with a cruise of about 7.5. So nothing really remarkable there. Just again, trying a different engine, or nacelle, or rather I should say, configuration. And that's about it. They did produce a number of these, but it was pretty quickly discovered that they had very limited combat potentiality. So actually the class, while it was only introduced in the late 2350s, was scheduled for early retirement in 2375. Newer vessels had come along. I don't want to say it was exactly a failure, but let's just say the galaxy started to become a lot meaner place. And what was essentially a transport cruiser was a bit of a sitting duck. But for what it was designed for in the early 2360s, while things were still calm, it did well. It could carry a relatively large amount of cargo or personnel to a place quite quickly and in good comfort. Although a little more crammed in there than previous types. If you notice, they're kind of building little vessels here. And here's another one. The Cheyenne class light cruiser explorer rapid response craft. Yet again, the quad cell Mafia strikes. This would be the replacement for the Constellation class, allowing it to be retired in the late 2350s. It's a little bit larger than the Springfield at about 360 meters, but it actually has a thinner saucer. So it only has a crew of roughly 300 to 350. It is capable of hitting warp 9.6, which kind of seems to be our new limit for a while, and it can sustain at about warp 9.3. So it's one of the faster vessels we've come across. It does have top and bottom photon launchers, more capable, and in fact they are of the newer multi-launch system, cluster system, plus strip phasers. So it does have reasonably good defensive capabilities, but it's still, like I said, a light cruiser. This was designed for deep space exploration, long-range survey missions, and, if necessary, border defense and patrol, and rapid response to distress calls, that kind of thing. If it were larger, it probably would have a heavier hitting ability, but as it is, it was really designed more for speed, and more speed in a straight line than lots of maneuverability and turning. And really, with this smaller vessel, they've tested what they want to test. They've tried out a few different nacelle styles and configurations, a few different saucer and hull configurations. The reason they've been building quite a few small ships, part of it was the impact of the Cardassian War. They had lost quite a few Mirandas and Excelsiors there, so they needed to replace them. And they had big things on the drawing board. But before we get to the major attraction and kind of the culmination of this development, let's briefly mention the good old Miranda again, because many are still in service even after the border wars, and they would continue to be refit and remodeled. Here's the USS Saratoga. It has a science pod with an extended sensor on each side. It also has improved nacelles, and it has photon torpedo tubes integrated into the hull. It doesn't have the roll bar, so they found ways to integrate it into the hull. This did sacrifice some internal volume, which is partially the reason for the external pods. But this is what we're going to see from the Miranda going forward, is kind of using it as a base to attach things onto. It's a good space frame, but we're still really stuck at warp 9 max and really cruising at about warp 7. But on the other hand, it only requires a crew as few as 25 or 30, and if you want, it can still easily support up to 200 scientists and researchers or otherwise, or even passengers if need be, or cargo. At least up until the 2340s, they were even still building brand new Miranda types. And then into the 2360s and 70s, they were refurbishing existing ones. So they had a lot of these, and they were going to use them. And why not? Vessels can last a long time, and a lot of these did hold their own against the Cardassians. Especially 2 or 3 of these, they can easily take on a Galore or 2. Of course, that says more about the Cardassians' abilities than it does the Federation. But I just wanted to point that out, that these, along with the Excelsiors, are still very much in the fleet, as the next generation finally comes onto the scene in 2363. If the Excelsior was the great experiment, the Galaxy class was the great hotel in the sky. This was the dream, the ambition of so many designers at Utopia Planitia, with work dating all the way back really to the launch of the Ambassador. This was a new way of thinking, and it was the largest, most complex, most advanced starship Starfleet, even the Federation, had launched to date. The USS Galaxy's keel was laid down in 2357 and was completed by 2361, in time for the anniversary of the Federation. And it would have a couple of years of shakedown and testing in the home system, by which time its 2 sister ships, the Yamato and the USS Enterprise, NCC 1701D, would be commissioned and ready. So 3 would be launched by 2364, and there were plans to build a dozen, kind of in honor of the original dozen constitutions, because this was designed for the same mission profile. Heavy cruiser, deep space, long range, long endurance exploration. The Galaxy class is over 640 meters long, 42 decks, and has a standard crew of over 1,000 and the ability to carry a lot more than that. Evacuation abilities well into the thousands, 5,000-6,000 easily. They could easily comfortably carry a couple of hundred diplomats, and that was kind of the idea. You could have entire conferences on board. It had not one, not two, but 3 full-size shuttle bays with multiple craft, from small work bees and pods all the way up to runabout class vessels available. And it had much of the new technology. It had the saucer separation and reattachment abilities from the Norlands. It also had the newer style deflector. It went with this pattern of nacelle, the updated warp engine. It was capable of reaching warp 9.6 and sustaining warp 9.3, which, considering its size and bulk, quite impressive. It had full phaser strips. It had a forward and a rear-facing multi-tube torpedo launcher, powerful shields, auxiliary bridge, full medical ward. It supported the new holodeck systems, arboretum. It even had a bar on board, because this was designed where it could go into combat, sure, but since it was dreamt up in a time of peace, and since by the time it was launched the Cardassian border wars were over, many hoped in the Federation that was it. So this was intended to have families and civilians, experts, doctors, researchers on board, and also host researchers and ambassadors and governors and kindergarten trips. And it looked it on the inside, fully carpeted and very not military. And that seemed like a good idea at the time, in the early 2360s. It really did. It showed the culmination of the Golden Age. It was simply an impressive ship, literally not even a village or a town, but a city in space, with the latest in warp drive, and most importantly, a truly new and advanced computer core system. Really, the biggest leap forward in computer technology since the duotronic system of the Constitution class. No expense was spared, every amenity given, which means these were very expensive and time-consuming to produce, hence the original goal of only building 12, which by the time of around 2372, that goal was completed. They would actually build more than 12 eventually, but they would be a later version that we will talk about. The true galaxy, deep space, science, exploration craft. It was a dream, and it did come to fruition, but unfortunately it was in an ever-changing galaxy. But before we move on to that, this was the Jewel, the flagship, the heavy cruiser, but it had a companion that would actually be more successful, more widely produced, and more widely used. The Nebula class medium cruiser, at about 525 meters long, about the same length as the old Ambassador, and really had about the same space as the Galaxy, just a more compacted star drive engineering section. The saucer was about the same. Had a slightly smaller crew of about 750, so pretty much like the old Excelsiors. A little less in the way of shuttle base, it's true, and by default, maybe a little less in the way of weaponry. But this was designed to be the everyday work ship. The Galaxy would go out, show the flag. This was designed with the same technology and would launch around the same time. The first Nebula was in service by around 2363, 2364, same as the Galaxy. But these were designed for exploration, but also support, long-term observation, and just generally handling things that needed doing around the Federation. To that end, they built upon the pod system, the customizable swapping out pod system tried out on the Springfield class. This here, the USS Melbourne, one of the earliest nebulas, has the secondary warp system pod, which could be used as a backup or to boost warp, or could be detached and installed on another ship if stricken. But it actually wasn't the most common system seen. No, we have different pods that can easily be swapped onto nebulas. The Melbourne was part of the first couple of experimental nebula types. And here we have the USS Phoenix, which is set up as a long-range sensor. Basically, we have a giant sensor pod here with supporting struts and equipment. This could be used for scientific missions or clandestine intelligence gathering. Very powerful, very effective at monitoring the goings-on of others, including Cardassians. And we see one of these able to more than hold its own against a Cardassian warship and detect what Cardassians were up to. We also see the interior, and no surprise, the bridge and ready room very much resemble a Galaxy, because essentially it's the same module. So this could be a scientific peacetime use version here with the sensor pod. You could also install a cargo pod there for transporting materials to a colony or medical supplies if there's an outbreak. But ironically, whereas the upcoming Dominion War would show the shortcomings of the Galaxy and other vessels like the Springfield, it would actually show the legitimacy and the usefulness of the Nebula class. So here's another nebula set up with a weapons pod. This has additional phaser arrays, at least 2, perhaps 3. More importantly, it has an additional photon torpedo multi-launch tube system with a very large torpedo magazine. Slap one of these on, you have additional power, additional phasers, lots of torpedoes, and it's a compact design, which makes shielding it easier than on a Galaxy. This variant, this configuration of a nebula, is actually very good at warfare. Or if you want to be more peaceful, border control and maintaining the peace. But this is all the same vessel, the last 3 we've looked at, by just swapping out a pod, which can be easily done at a starbase or outpost in just a couple of weeks, maybe even a few days if the need really is important. And theoretically, you could put on a shuttle bay or anything else there. And these were less expensive and required a smaller crew than a Galaxy. And they didn't seem to have the vulnerability of the star drive that the Galaxy was unfortunately known for. I'm not saying the Nebula was a better design than the Galaxy, but I'm kind of saying the Nebula was a better design. Let me say it was a more practical design, much like the Miranda before it. This was the Galaxy's Miranda equivalent, and much like the Miranda, it'll probably outlive its heavy cruiser big brother. And they were designed together and launched together and meant to work together. And we're nearing the end of the Starfleet before the big event, but there are still a couple more ships to mention. Just when you thought the spherical main pressure hull was gone, it's back, inspired by the old Daedalus and the original Ambassador, the Medusan type. We have the Olympic class. Now this is the USS Pasteur, a medical frigate at about 320 meters long, It's quite compact and efficient, but because of the large secondary and primary hulls, there's plenty of room. Now, as a hospital ship, the primary hull is dedicated to operating theaters and hospital beds, with a secondary hull dedicated to a large shuttle bay, trauma center, essentially an ER. You have kind of an ER here, first response and triage with a large shuttle bay. You also have large transporter systems for patients that are stable enough to be transported, and then they could be taken to the main hull for surgery and recovery. There's also ways to section off wards to prevent spread of infection, contagious diseases, things of that nature. And this is a very fast ship. It has modern warp engines thanks to its compact design. It too is capable of hitting or even exceeding warp 9.6. It's quite possible that this can hit 9.7, even greater, for short bursts. And it has quite strong shields. However, the medical version is unarmed by design because of its role. By the way, the primary deflector is actually housed in the bottom part of the spherical hull right here. Bridge on top, pretty normal. And there are other variants. We see the USS Pasteur and the USS Nobel as the medical versions. That's fine. We do see other variants on this basic hull that serve as colonial transports and the like, and those may have light phaser armament, but that's about it. This is definitely more of a humanitarian ship, a supply ship, an evacuation ship, hence why it looks so different. But these came into service in the 2360s and would be critical during the upcoming Dominion War, saving many lives, also helping evacuate many settlements under threat, and they would remain very much in service into the 25th century. Very useful, very flexible design, and an alternative thing. In some ways, this is exactly what Starfleet and the Federation are about. Unfortunately, the rest of the galaxy is not necessarily so peaceful. Part of that is we have Section 31. But when that fails and there's a battle, you're going to need to clean up after yourselves, because the Federation is not about littering. And for that, we have a special ship too. Meet the Starfleet Tug. Just Tug. This is a very utilitarian vessel, and it is meant to do immediate repair response, just to keep a ship's warp core online. It has some tools on board, and then it has both tractor beams and actual physical manipulators, and that's so it can get a ship stable and then take it back into warp and get it to a starbase. It's only about 90 meters long. It only has a crew of about 6. Most of it's automated. In a lot of ways, it's an overgrown shuttle. But only one of these is needed to take most ships in, maybe 2 for a galaxy. They can really tug above their weight. Now, they're only capable of reaching warp 6, and as their load increases, that drops, but it can get wreckage out of space, either to salvage it or just to clear the space lanes. And these would operate out of star bases and always be deployed to clean up after a battle. And they actually use a variant of the old tried and true Constitution nacelle system, because while they're not the fastest, they are powerful for what they are, and just dependable. You don't want your own tug breaking down, so that's why they went with it. We have a bridge and habitation module on the top. You have some docking interfaces to rescue crews, but most of the bottom is given way to machinery and the mechanics of the vessel. Not pretty, but extremely necessary. You can also find smaller versions of these working around space docks as well. These were always important, but again, with the Dominion War, they would become vital to the effort because ships had to be salvaged whenever possible. But of course, when they were designed, no one knew what was coming. And that's why the Starfleet of this era looks so serene, so peaceful, so blissfully unaware of what's out there and what's coming. Let's begin the talk part by looking at the transports real quick. And let's begin with the Wharfen class. It's neat that they did this. This has a kind of unique place in Star Trek history because it was the first fully CGI model ever used in the show. They'd done partial CGI before. Of course, this was at the beginning of Generations, the ship that the Elorians were on. We see 2 of these. And, yeah, they don't survive too long. It was said to be inspired by a truck. Take it for what you will. Not much to say about it, but it's neat that Eaglemoss did it, because it was in the show. Kind of the same thing goes for the Jenolan here, the quote-unquote Sydney class. It's one of the later style physical models they did. They actually used the shuttle from the films and they attached nacelles and they gave it a bridge module. It's neat that they actually found Scotty in a new ship, not just reuse of whatever. I think it's very convincing, and it does share a little bit of a resemblance with the Wharfen too, just in being a personnel transport. It's a good size as well. It's a little bit light. A lot of it is plastic, but the center part's metal, but a lot of the externals are plastic. And yeah, they did a perfectly good job. Again, background ships, I've said many times, make me happy because a few manufacturers do them. Next we have the Zoza and the Arcos. These are actually the same studio miniature based on the Batris, just reworked. This is of course Cassidy Yates' ship, and they did a really good job with them. It's very heavy, it's almost entirely metal, chunky design, big thrusters in the back. My only gripe with it, and it won't be the first or the last I say, is that it clips onto the stand a little loose, but the main problem is it's so heavy. It works, but a center mount would have probably been better, and I think they realized that later. This came pretty early in the series, so when they did the Arcos here, which came quite late, this is from the episode with Tasha Yar's sister, but it was also used in other episodes like the Outrageous Icona. They went to that more center mount. Now this is a lighter model. It's the same miniature in real life, but they kind of scaled it down a wee bit. It's one reason I do like Eaglemoss. They don't just take the same mold and reuse it, repaint it. Each time they do make a new mold, even with their Miranda class variants. You'd think they would just make them kind of a... But no, they don't. Each one's different. But yeah, this is just kind of generic ship background, but we saw it used by the Federation in that. Not much to say about it. It's kind of weird seeing the Federation use a very non-standard ship, but it does kind of go with the aesthetic. We see quite a few things in service with Starfleet over the years. And yeah, so we have neat little background ships with these. Next, let's talk about the ambassador-related ships, and first start off with the Concept. This is the Andrew Probert Concept, and we did see it as a painting in Star Trek. So this was what they were expecting the Enterprise C to be in seasons 1 and 2. And you really do see how it's supposed to be a blending of Excelsior and Enterprise D, the Galaxy. The nacelles really do kind of do that, especially the star drive. It really is a good blending. Unfortunately, to realize this as a full studio model, while it could have easily been done on a movie budget, or maybe like a show premiere, it really could not be done on a average day of the week budget. So when it came time for yesterday's Enterprise, which is a great episode and everyone kind of loves it, but it was just an episode, they ended up making this instead as Enterprise C, because they could make this. Very simple rounded shapes, simple nacelles, rounded main hull, but at least they did make it a new ship. This model does not have visible impulse on the back, and that's actually correct for the original issue of the Ambassador's class. Later on in season 4 and 5, we see slight alterations of this with more details. The neck moved back a bit and the nacelles pushed back. So there are variants we see in the show. But considering they had to put this model together on a TV budget for a regular 42-minute episode, they did a good job, I think. And this design I've always liked ever since I was a kid. And while it wasn't impossible to find in toy form or model form, it definitely wasn't as common as the Enterprise A or D. It's a little bit of a light model. The star drive's all plastic, the saucer's the metal. But when they had to do the Enterprise C, and it looks really nice. They did an XL version, which I do have, but I wanted to keep this moving, and there we go. And our third, directly associated with the Ambassador, the Niagara class. One of the famous Wolf 359 kit bashes. And obviously these are just regular Galaxy class nacelles glued onto the Ambassador main hull, and with a mostly Ambassador looking saucer. It's a little different. I have a hard time putting my finger on it, but it is a little different. But since it's one of the few Ambassador adjacent ships we get to see, it definitely had to be mentioned. And yeah, it's a 3 nacelle design. I like it. There's only one problem, and it has to do with the actual Eaglemoss model. Even though it does clip onto the back of the saucer, this is incredibly front heavy, and it likes to slide off at the barest breeze. They really should have put more of a rake on it. One thing you can do is in the hole on the stand, you can put a little blue tack at the front, kind of forcing it to tilt back. It just needs like a couple of degrees adjustment, and it's fine. And on a shelf setting average, it's fine, but it can easily get knocked forward because of it being front heavy. I just wanted to mention it. I like the model. I'm glad they did it, but it will do that. So FYI. So now let's move on to kind of the star of this video, at least the first half, the Excelsior. And this is by design a very long but skinny model in this scale, because that's the Excelsior. It was meant to look faster and sleeker and dwarf the Enterprise when we see it first in Star Trek 3. And again, we've had this in quite a few series in the past, but Eaglemoss had to do it. It's pretty light though. I will say I kind of wish they had done the star drive in metal. I think they could have. The saucer is, but then this whole back piece is plastic, and that's fine on the smaller star drive ships, but when that's so much of the vessel, it does make it kind of light. So I would have liked a metal star drive, but you might say they might not have been able to get the detail they wanted in there. Either way, they had to do the Excelsior, and they did it very early on. And likewise, even though it is similar, they had to do the Enterprise B. Now, of course, the Excelsior model was used for all kinds of ships in TNG. The Hood comes to mind. And we only see this version for the B and then the Lakota. And it was just the same model with add-ons, including these fins here, which I don't mind. Also, the back of the nacelles have been finned up a bit. I've said it many times, and I still kind of feel this way. The impulse manifolds, the way they just added these two, it's not how I would have done it. Either I would have removed the center ones and just had these two, or I would have added two more but made them look the same as here. But having two different styles of impulse drives just seems weird to me. But I get it, what they were trying to do. And it does make the B look a little different. And in some ways I do like it better. It's kind of one of those debated things in Star Trek. One nice thing about this model over the Excelsior, there's actually metal down here now, so it is heavier. It's funny, with a lot of the series, they use more and more plastic as the line goes on, but a lot of times Eaglemoss would do more and more metal. And the Enterprise B is a good example of that versus the original Excelsior. It also sits on its stand a little better. Some of the early stands are a little wonky. Later on, they kind of found their footing. So those are the two Excelsiors we see on screen, but I'm really happy they also did these. The three study models. And this is really where I think the Eaglemoss collection shines, doing these weird background ships and fan favorites, just because no one else is ever going to do them. This forward nacelle is pretty basic and sleek. You can kind of see what they were going for. To some people, this would definitely look faster than the good old Connie. Maybe not to everyone. And then this one here is just a bulkier look. And then finally we had the famous USS Alka-Seltzer, which was in the not graveyard scene, but the scene in Unifications, the Qualler retirement home for starships, with a very interesting saucer. So, as a wreck, it did get some screen time. It's quite possible this was meant to be in the best of both worlds graveyard scene there with the wrecked fleet, but that shot was just not used. They said that when they did the Qualler depot, they used the same footage, but this appeared in it, so probably they used alternative takes or a wider shot, and this was able to appear in. And these were made as very basic wood popsicle stick styrene foam miniatures in 82, 83 when they were working on Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. But this is probably the most realized they've ever been in actuality. So I'm happy they did these. They were pretty late in the collection. I'm kind of surprised they did not do these as a bonus or special edition like they did the Andrew Probert Enterprise C, but no, they were in the regular collection. Kind of interesting. Next, we have a true definition of love-hate. Both from Deep Space Nine, both kit bashes, but one fan favorite and one, well, it's not the most bemoaned vessel, because another one exists we'll look at in the next video, but close to it. The funny thing is, if it did not have this engineering hull plopped on and it were just a simple basic nacelles attached to a saucer, it'd look pretty good. But throwing this on, especially throwing it out front with this kind of bulbous where it used to connect, is just hilarious. I guess it is unique looking. I'll give it that. Plus, I mean, the USS Raging Queen. There's a name with several meanings, but it's hilarious that Eaglemoss did this, and kind of cool they did. And they didn't just take the regular Excelsior model and kit bash it themselves. They actually made a new mold because this is a larger saucer. On the other hand, the Centaur, USS Centaur, is a fan favorite. This is Charlie Reynolds' ship in the show. Goes up against Cisco and his own Jem'Hadar fighter, and they did a great job. It's a nice, simple ship. And got a little pod down here. Yeah, fan favorite. It looks a little small. Actually, the model, if you measure it, is actually quite big, but because it's so spindly, it seems smaller than it is. But in the show, this was a pretty small little light cruiser or even frigate type, so it fits. The model feels appropriate. And just an old background ship that, again, most manufacturers would not do. And props to Eaglemoss for doing it. Before we get to the fleet, let's look at a couple more secondary craft. The unnamed Starfleet tug. One of a few different tugs we get. True kit bash, seen after a battle in DS9. These nacelles are actually from a Romulan warbird, although they could probably pass for something from a Constitution type thing. And the top part, which is the habitation section, is actually taken from a runabout. And then you just have like parts put on. But it's a tug. And that Eaglemoss actually did it in a really good size. It's actually pretty weighty too. It's a kind of a metal block with plastic on the outside. And then another fan favorite, and actually made by Bill George, who worked for ILM. We have the Olympic class Beverly Crusher ship, the USS Pasteur. By the way, Bill also made the Y-wing in Star Wars. It's great they did this, and even though we see this in the possible, what they call it, the anti-time future, we do know these do serve in reality because we see them, the USS Noble, during the Dominion War. So it's a hospital ship. It would definitely be in service for decades, and Eaglemoss did a good job. Part of the sphere is plastic on top, metal on bottom, and that actually leads to a mostly metal secondary hull, and then plastic nacelles. I like to imagine this wasn't armed because it's a hospital ship. In real life, in World War I, hospital ships did not have armament. And I like that it's a callback to the Daedalus, which itself was a callback to an early design from Matt Jeffries. Like the ring ship, it was found it would not really work, but it was considered. So yeah, there's that. Not a lot to say about them, but really glad we have them in the collection. They definitely add something. Don't you think? Another civilian or support ship, we have the SS Raven, 7 of 9's parents, Annika Hansen's parents, Magnus and something. Anyway, neat they did it. It's basically a big runabout, but it does have a shuttle bay in the back, so room for at least a couple of shuttle pods. I'm not going to critique that episode and the foolishness of those scientists, but yeah, it's a little light. It's mostly plastic, and you'd think it'd be more metal. The metal's back here, but it's still a nice model. I think they went with plastic so they get more detailing fine in the hull. The size is good. But yeah, just a neat little background ship. The nacelles actually kind of match the Olympic class we looked at just a second ago, meaning that they probably came from a similar desire not to have a starship, which is why they have alternative designs. This one was clearly meant for science and kind of personal missions, maybe like archaeological missions too. It's nice to have it in the collection. It really is. I don't think we see it outside of the SS Raven, do we though? Let me know in the comments. So, what do you think? Are we ready to get to the fleet? Alright, let's talk the Wolf 359 fleet. Well, briefly, the Galaxy class, because so much of what makes up the fleet is kit bashes, actually of real models of the Enterprise. This was, of course, the very first edition that Eaglemoss ever did, kind of where they'd have to start, and it's mostly a really good job. I mean, you could tell it was their first attempt, and that's good and bad. It doesn't mean they know everything that they would learn after building these for years, but on the other hand, they usually put a lot of effort, and it's a pretty heavy model. The saucer's the metal, star drive's the plastic, and it's clipped into the stand very tight. They actually gave these away or sold them really cheap to get the collection going with a lot of people. But of course, lots of companies have done Enterprise Ds. Again, it's a good representation. It's larger than the old Micro Machines. It really is quite a good size. It's one of the larger vessels in this scale and type. And of course, we've had other versions like the Future Enterprise, and we've had the XL and things of that nature. But yeah, that kind of was the foundation for the Wolf 359 fleet, because they were just meant to be literally cannon fodder. And now one of my favorite classes, the Nebula. We actually do see the Melbourne here, the one that was supposed to be Riker's command, direct in the Battle of 359. It's often called the prototype Nebula because they hadn't quite worked out what they were going to do with it, so it's a little bit different than our later ones. And this is actually the last version that Eaglemoss released. I'm not really sure what the point of the little baby nacelles on top is, frankly. Kind of glad we really didn't see this variant more. But I think just one standard size nacelle on top would have made a better look, kind of a tri nacelle. But having two little ones and two big ones, I'm not really sure what the point of that was. But oh well. Again, it's nice that they finally did do the Melbourne to help kind of fill out the Wolf 359 fleet. Of course, it's interesting they did two other versions of the Nebula. Actually, they did this one first with the weapons pod, and then they did this one with the sensor pod, which is the Phoenix, which is one of the better episodes of TNG in my opinion. So, we have all three of these, and essentially the difference, aside from the name, is the pod. There are a tiny number of detail differences, but yeah. Let's talk the highlighter ships, the ones with markers. Here's the Springfield. Yeah, they literally made the nacelles out of office marker highlighter things. Threw a pot on, kind of have a weird small star drive, and then of course a kit bashed saucer, and a very, very small deflector. And I actually like this ship. It actually does kind of harken. It almost seems like I was going to say a proto-nebula, but not really because the nacelles are up. But yeah, the star drive and the hot saucer very much seem nebula. We know nothing about these ships, even years and years on. They really haven't been expanded on, so everyone, myself included, when we talk about these, they just kind of make stuff up because the ships from this fleet have never really been filled out to any great extent. But yeah, I do like the Springfield. It's one of my more favorite of the kit bashes. Another marker ship, and its better half, perhaps. The Cheyenne is a quaddie, and a real-world reason they did a quad nacelle was just to make it look distinctive. These are also markers, and you can tell this was a chopped-off Galaxy neck on both sides. And a fun fact, if you look at it, notice how thin the saucer is. It bulges out in the middle, and it's that way on both sides. Keep that in mind. So very thin on the saucer edge. Nice little model that Eaglemoss did. These pylons also seem to be from maybe a Constitution refit model kit. I'm not sure. So that's the Cheyenne. And I wanted to mention it because when you look at the Challenger, look at this saucer. Looks normal from the top. Flip it over, and again, looks the same. What they did, they took two Galaxy class models. And instead of attaching top and bottom saucers, they actually put two bottoms together to make the Cheyenne saucer, and they put two tops together to make the Challenger saucer. I'm talking about, of course, in the real world. Of course, Eaglemoss molds these differently. And for the back half here, the directors said that this was actually taken from a submarine kit, and that one of the nacelle struts was actually the tower, the conning tower from the submarine. And they couldn't remember what they made the other one out of. It's kind of weird that the top nacelle is taller than the bottom, but it's okay. Of course, they're just regular Galaxy nacelles. No more markers. No real visible deflector. It's one of the smaller ones, the little miniature from Eaglemoss. And yes, it does look like a lollipop. Yeah. It's a ship. It does ship things. Moving right along. A couple of frigates. We have the Freedom class here. USS Firebrand or Concord. For a very long time, this was the only canon single nacelle ship. We had the Hermes and Saladin and the kind of beta canon. Of course, these days we have others. First the Kelvin, and now Strange New Worlds was given a single nacelle, but for a long time this was it. Pretty standard. You have a Galaxy saucer with some stuff put on the bottom, including the cannon, and then you have a Galaxy nacelle, obviously taken from a larger type kit. But one fun thing, the neck is actually taken from a Constitution refit kit. You can see the torpedo tubes there and the docking port on the side. So here we do see bits of a Constitution thrown in. I actually like this one. This too is a little bit smaller, but because of the nacelle it sticks out more, kind of like the Challenger. But I've always had a secret little thing. I kind of like the Freedom class. But my favorite out of the fleet is the Narlands class. This was meant to be a miniature Galaxy. Frankly, probably a more practical Galaxy. And have the hull, have nacelles swept back on pylons, and we have these modules on top and bottom, which again were basically office supplies. I think they were highlighters or, again, markers. But in universe, we can say they're either sensor pods, cargo pods, or torpedo pods. They really just were installed to A, make it look a little different, and B, make it look a little smaller. And all they really did to make it seem smaller was just rework a few things. So really, when you compare like the bridge and the windows and the Narlands, they really don't match up to what it's supposed to be. But again, this was just a ship. And later on, it's decided that the Rutledge that O'Brien served on was one of these, and also the Thomas Paine, which was spoken about but not seen on screen from Conspiracy, was one of these. So, you know, they're around. They seem to be more combat oriented than some of the others, but I really do like this design. Simple, elegant, it's more practical size and everything wise than I think a Galaxy. And it would make sense before going into a huge project like the Galaxy class that they would try out these technologies on a smaller scale before kind of combining them all into one. That's why I tried to give a backstory with each of these, testing out various components that would later come in on the Galaxy. But now it makes me very happy that Eaglemoss ended up doing all of the Wolf 359 ships, even ones that were kind of late to the party, like Cisco's ship, the USS Saratoga, which is obviously just a Miranda. They basically took the Landry style and added these pods on the sides, and there you go. Also, it had a Vulcan captain. This was not seen in the original Best of Both Worlds, but that's okay, because they said 40 ships were there, 39 were destroyed, and they only showed, you know, a dozen at most on screen, and not even all those identifiable. They built in, with the script, room for other ships to be added to to the fleet for story purposes, which they took advantage of with Emissary, the pilot of DS9, so it fits in just fine. Still a little sad sending a Miranda against a Borg cube, but you can tell they were just collecting whatever ships they could find to encounter the Borg. And to Starfleet in the year 2366, the 40 ships was a large armada for that time. So, the Borg fleet, folks. The series of events that would ultimately end the golden age of peace, science exploration for Starfleet, and would lead to a fundamental change in reevaluation in starship design and construction, well, they would date back to 2364, when a Borg scout vessel did an early kind of hunt and kill run through the neutral zone, just killing and assimilating, presumably, both humans and Romulans. The next year, the Enterprise would encounter the Borg cube in the Beta Quadrant, which would trace them back to Earth, leading to 2366. The Borg would first assimilate a colony, and also at least 2 starships would be ran into and destroyed. The Enterprise would slow down the Borg cube enough that Admiral J.P. Hansen, I always want to call him Chris Hansen, is able to assemble the 40-ship fleet and intercept the cube at Wolf 359, a star system roughly 8 light years outside of the Sol system, Earth, Sector 001. These are the vessels that were there. There were up to 4 Nebula-class ships, at least 2 Excelsiors, 1 Ambassador, and 1 Galaxy, J.P. Hansen's command ship, although we don't know its name. There was even an Oberth and a couple of Mirandas, including the Saratoga. And, yeah, the only survivor would seem to be the USS Endeavour, which was a Nebula class. See, that's why the Nebula class is good. It was actually the only one that could stand up. And this would be a decisive loss for the Federation. 39 ships destroyed, 11,000 personnel either killed, assimilated, or simply missing in action, floating in space. And some of the ships were able to be salvaged, but it would take well over a year to rebuild the fleet, about 18 months. And it would force an examination of tactics, and in the interim, tensions with the Cardassians and Romulans were rising. A new Klingon Chancellor was an unknown, and therefore starship design would start to change as early as 2368. But that's why I wanted to end this video here, even though I planned for making these a little longer. This is just such a good cutting off point, even though we really just covered about 75 years of history in this video. This is just a natural break point. Very few of these designs would actually survive into the next era. My Nebula would be one of them. They would keep making those. And they would also keep making Galaxies, but they would get a refit, a kind of a change. And surviving older ships like the Excelsior and the Miranda would continue, but they would get major refits too. The Lakota refit for the Excelsior and a Miranda refit we will look at next time. Yeah, that was the Battle of Wolf 359. I will just end by saying when the Borg come again in 2373, the Battle of Sector 001, it was a much different fight, because in just 6 years, Starfleet really got back on its original footing, kind of fell out of its complacency. But that's the next video. Let's wrap this up. Alrighty, folks, there we have it. Video 3 in the can. I wanted to include the Federation civilian ships and private ships just because I trying to do a complete human ship breakdown here. And then, of course, all of these go together so very well. Most being from that Starfleet, Wolf 359, but not all. Of course, like the rest of the videos, these are all Eaglemoss. And for the first time, these are actually all in the same size type. The regular edition, which is usually 3 to 5 inches. Which is why they made so many, including 3 nebula variants in and of themselves. Although I do kind of wish they had made some of the Galaxy variants, believe it or not. Especially the DS9 Dominion War version. But oh well, we got tugs. What an odd one for them to make. But I've told you what I like. What do you like? What do you think of these? Let me know in the comments. And as I've said before, once I'm done with this series, which will definitely now be 4 ports, maybe even more, then I'll probably do a supercut. Good golly, are there a lot of Federation starships. I knew what I was signing up for when I started this, though. Appreciate you hanging out with me this long. If you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.